Nicolette made her way to her chamber. There was barely half an hour left until dinner. Her maid helped her remove the simple dress the princess had acquired to remain inconspicuous and quickly stowed it in the wardrobe. Only then did she ring for another servant. The second servant began to quickly unbraid the princess's hair to style it into a higher updo, as was the custom at the time. Another servant brought a light blue silk gown adorned with delicate lace at the neckline. The princess always changed into a more elaborate gown with a deeper neckline in the evenings, so the servant was not surprised to find Nicolette in her petticoat. She dabbed the princess's forehead and hands with rosewater, then helped her into the gown, lacing it up at the back. Her hair was restyled into a higher updo, lightly dusted with powder, and a small silver brooch was pinned to her bodice. Finally, the servant fastened a pearl necklace around her neck and slipped delicate pearl earrings into her ears. The princess took one last look in the mirror, straightened her posture, and headed to dinner. Her thoughts, however, were elsewhere. Edward had thought he was merely reassuring her that things would turn out well for him, but his vision contained remarkable details that meant nothing to him but spoke volumes to her. A house with an octagonal tower and a large garden, that was the countryside estate the king owned on the other side of the island in a small spa town. It was not a place where she would typically reside, and certainly not a place where she could be buried if she were to become queen one day. And Nicolette was the rightful heir to the throne. The king had no son and had ensured that the ancient laws of the land were changed so that the crown could pass to a female line. Nicolette was to be the first queen of Le Pays d'Assine. In the past, she would have married a close relative who would then become king. She knew that as queen, she would have a grand funeral and be laid to rest in the family crypt in the capital, with crowds of people in attendance. Given her status, she could never marry someone like a teacher or a pastor. She couldn't make sense of it all. She had always dreamed of marrying someone like Edward Sandcreek. Through his books, filled with inspiring accounts of God's work, he had been a role model for her for many years. But whenever she prayed for such a husband, the word "like" was never absent from her prayers. She assumed her future husband would be a count who, like many nobles in their small Protestant kingdom, would also be a model of virtue and piety, but a wealthy and noble man. What would have to happen for her to even consider someone from an entirely different social class? Nicolette shook her head to dismiss such thoughts and entered the dining room. She didn't want anyone to notice that something was troubling her. Dinner was the main and most important meal of the day, as well as a social occasion. There was always at least one prominent noble present, someone who held an important position on the island. At the head of the long oak table, its carved legs adorned with the symbols of the ruling dynasty, sat the king, his face marked by fatigue and tension. The question of what would become of their small kingdom weighed on him day and night. To his right sat Princess Nicolette and her two younger sisters, Célestine and Gabrielle, alongside their aging governess. To the king's left sat Duke Croix, an older man with sharp features and one of the king's confidants. Also present were Count de Montreuil, his wife, and their son, who was the same age as Nicolette and betrothed to her younger sister. For Nicolette, however, her father had not yet chosen a husband. Arranging a marriage for the future queen was a delicate matter. Before the revolution, negotiations had been underway for her betrothal to the son of a French duke, whose father was lynched by an angry mob during the summer unrest. The young man, stripped of his status and wealth, had fled to America, and to the young princess's relief, the arrangement fell apart. The last thing that could be said of him was that he was a model of piety. Two other noblemen, who managed the island's port and finances, were also seated at the table, quietly discussing business matters. Silver platters held stuffed partridges, buttered stewed vegetables, potatoes, bread, and bowls of fresh fruit. The servants moved silently around the diners, almost like ghosts, refilling wine in cut-glass goblets and ensuring no one lacked for anything. Nicolette watched with concern as some of the guests quickly emptied their goblets. She knew that if her father drank too much, he could become unpleasant. The conversation at the king's end of the table turned to news from France and fears of unrest that threatened to reach even their peaceful island. Though everyone tried to maintain the appearance of light conversation, the king's face betrayed his deep concerns. Nicolette did not join in the discussion. She exchanged a few words with her sister to her right, focused on picking at her portion of partridge, and listened to her father's conversation. It wasn't until the topic turned to Edward Sandcreek that she looked up from her plate. "I hope you won't have him executed," she ventured to address the king. "You know he's my favorite writer. And there's never been anything political in his books." The king frowned. "I don't want to hear the words favorite and Sandcreek in the same sentence ever again, or it will be bad," he said threateningly. "Of course, if he means that much to you, I can have his head sent to you on a silver platter. You can hang it in the hallway next to all those stuffed deer." Nicolette knew such words didn't necessarily mean Edward had no hope, they were more a sign that she had missed the right moment to broach such a serious topic and that her father had already drunk too much. The king, however, was clearly not done with the topic. He had uttered his first threat quietly, but now he raised his voice slightly so that the other two princesses, Celestine and Gabrielle, whom Nicolette had undoubtedly influenced with her love of reading, could hear him as well. "Let none of you even think of doing something as foolish as going to chat with your favorite writer, let alone helping him in any way. Otherwise, you'll find out personally whether your father still has any strength left in his arms," the king declared sternly. "Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Nicolette nodded, quickly raising her goblet to her lips. It had been a long time since she'd heard a threat of a beating. She knew she would have to be very careful in the coming days. So, she decided to change the subject and asked, "Will you need me here now? Would it be a problem if I went to our country house in Les for a few days? I'd like to spend some time painting. I haven't had much time for it this summer." Nicolette knew this excuse would sound plausible. She was a talented painter, and her works regularly supported various charitable organizations. Her paintings weren't sold just because she was a princess, they were genuinely beautiful. Of course, if she used painting as an excuse, she would indeed dedicate time to it, but her main goal was different. She was worried about what the immediate future might bring and had decided to transport a number of valuables to the country house, primarily her personal jewelry and some of the treasures that adorned the princess's shared spaces, including a few paintings, a rare tapestry, vases, several valuable manuscripts, bolts of expensive fabric she had recently received as gifts, and a few musical instruments that had belonged to her mother. These were not only highly valuable but also held personal significance as mementos of her mother, who, unlike Nicolette, had always been more inclined toward music than painting. Instead of answering, the king looked at Duke Croy and asked, "When is that surprise of yours supposed to arrive?" "I expect the day after tomorrow, Your Majesty," the Duke replied. "Then you can't go anywhere," the king said curtly. "A surprise?" Nicolette looked at the Duke, puzzled. "What's this about?" The Duke cleared his throat. "The meaning of the word surprise, Your Highness, is that you don't know what it entails beforehand, and then you're surprised when something happens, you receive something, meet someone, or something unexpected occurs. That's why it's called a surprise." The Duke tried to maintain a serious expression during his explanation, then smiled, raised an eyebrow, and gave the princess a long look. The company then moved to two separate salons, where the gentlemen continued their conversations among themselves. Nicolette had no further opportunity to pry, but the word surprise sparked more apprehension than curiosity in her.